A warm welcome to this teaching seminar, where I'm privileged to be joined by two good Lausanne friends here, Roland Werner from Marburg, Germany, and Lindsay Brown from Wales. Welcome, both of you. Welcome, Roland.
Thank you. Hello.
And Lindsay.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
And the topic for this teaching seminar is lessons from church history, or how the gospel has impacted the Christian worldview, has impacted the history of Europe. And of course, that's a huge topic. And we are now, in between the first evening and the last morning. And on the first evening, you presented, Roland, a sort of a 10-minute overview of especially focusing on the early church. And we're looking forward to hearing, listening to you, Lindsay, on the lessons from history, especially focusing on the Reformation and on the post-Reformation times on Saturday. So this is in between a more of a at liberty conversation between the three of us. So let's start with something more personal about history. Roland, why did you become interested in history?
Well, as a young boy growing up in Germany, I was surrounded by history, and especially the after effects of the Second World War. I grew up in Duisburg, which was heavily bombed, and about 90% of the city were actually destroyed. So we used to play in the 50s and 60s amongst the rubbles and the ruins of the neighboring plots. There was many houses being built, and so my parents built a house, but still we were surrounded by that. And so we used to hear about those times of the war, and so history in that, say, very specific sense of the negative history, of course, of the Second World War and that which caused it, and the German part, the guilt that we had as Germans in that, and the Nazi regime, which was a terrible regime, not only for the world, but also for the German population. All that was very, very much present. And then in school, I was taught, I think, the history of the Roman Empire 3 times, because we had Latin from 5th grade on, and we had Roman history. And I think just by hearing it 3 times, I forget everything. Nowadays, when I read it, I feel like I should know this. I had this in school. But then I think I always realized that history holds a lot of the keys to the present. Maybe not the only key, but it's a very important key to understanding where we are today and what we can learn for the future.
And before passing on the baton to Lindsay here about hearing your background, Roland, you also focused on a specific geographical area later on. Can you tell us something about where that is and why you became interested in that?
Yes, well, as a young student, I realized that there are parts of the world that have been saturated with the Gospels and the other parts that don't, where there's very few workers. And I met some missionaries who worked in what was later called the 1040 windows, which is like the area where a lot of the people are Muslim, in at least nominally in their religion, and the Christian workers amongst them were few. So in my own prayer, I said, Lord, if you want to send me to those areas, I'm willing. You can always keep me here. It's easier to keep me, but it's maybe it's a bit harder to move somebody. So I want to move forward. And that brought me eventually to Egypt and to the Sudan and to other parts of North Africa. And that's where I started not only working and trying to share the Bible, but also to study the history of those areas, especially the Nile Valley.
Well, the Nile Valley. We'll come back to that later on, Roland. But what about you, Lindsay? Where did your interest in history, where was that kindled?
It probably started in high school. I studied history for what is called A or advanced level in school. 3 subjects you have to do more intensively before entry into university. And the best teacher I had was the history teacher who invested a lot in me, as with some others, and got us to read around the subject. Then I went on to study European history, modern European history in Oxford University. And because I had spent 2 years studying the period 15 to 1700 in high school, I specialized in that area in Oxford too. So in our final exams, there were 10 examinations, but 9 of them I did on just those 200 years. I became fascinated by it because I began to see that you can't understand the modern world, particularly modern Europe, without understanding what happened in that 200-year period. I have to confess I was much more interested in that period than I was in 20th century history, because I felt I was too close to the events of the 20th century. But I came to the settled conviction that what happened in the 15 and 1600s really laid the foundations for modern Europe. As one friend said to me, if you don't know where you've come from, you won't know who you are, and you certainly won't know where you should be going. So I felt it was important to understand our cultural and historical roots.
So thanks for sharing, both of you. And it seems that it has to do with roots and has to do with where we come from, as you say, Lindsay. And we, if we start from the very center of our existence, in a way, we have a family history, we have a extended family history, a nation history, a cultural history, and then we are focusing beyond that on the continental history we are part of. But maybe before we do that, has the personal and family history meant a lot to you? Start with Lindsay this time.
It has. I grew up in a close-knit family. I think I was the only. I'm the first evangelical Christian, or that I know of in the family. That is a person who decides, whose aspiration is to live under the authority of the Scriptures and the Lordship of Christ. There were members of my family who had, when I first decided to follow Christ, had a nominal attachment, but it wasn't an integral or central feature in their lives. Subsequently, many of them came to that position, but that was the case at that time. I grew up in a slightly unusual context, in the sense that I was raised mainly by my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, because in the mid-1950s, when I was born, my parents were trying to start a business in their married life. They worked together. And so my grandmother, who lived nearby, and grandfather looked after my brother and myself until we were able to go to school on our own. And then we moved in to be with our parents, because they lived on top of the shop or the supermarket they owned. And my mother didn't want her boys to be living on top of the business. However, when I was about 8 or 9, my grandfather died suddenly of a heart attack. It shattered my grandmother. They were very close. So my parents put me to live with my grandmother. I think the idea was just for a few months, for companionship, because we were already close. And I stayed with her on my own for 12 years. From the age of 7 or 8 until I went to university at 19, I just lived on my own with my grandmother. Saw my mother most days. But she was the major shape on my life. And it was actually she who sent me to a Sunday school on Sunday afternoons. And that's where I heard the gospel and became a Christian. Subsequently, she asked me to read the Bible to her every night. She had left school at 13 herself, didn't have much reading skills. She saw that something had happened in my life. And about 2 years after I decided to follow Christ, she too had that experience and determined to follow him. So I'm very grateful for her influence on shaping my life.
What about you, Roland?
Yes, I think I've mentioned a little bit of that already, that my father was a refugee from Eastern Germany, Pomerania, you say in English, which is now part of Poland. And that was always there. He comes from an area that we don't go to, we cannot go to. He was a prisoner of war in Egypt for 4 years. So Egypt was there. What's the history of that? And then the other side, my grandparents, my mother's father was very much anti-Hitler, and he stood up for the Jews. He was a simple man, but still they were members of the confessing church, as we say. So they knew that this ideology, which was the Nazi ideology, which also reached into the church, was not of God. And he often said that if Hitler is against the Jews, then God will punish him, which of course happened. And so being just a simple man from a farm on the one hand, through his understanding of the scripture, he had an understanding of history. So for me, history was always present in those different strands. And I think I understood that history is important to, as I said, to understand the present, and as Lindsay just said.
And both of you come from context where, you know, evangelical revivals have been very decisive. I'm thinking of Wales now, Lindsay, the influence of the important Welsh revival in the early 20th century. Could you say a few words about that?
Yes, I mean, I was privileged both as a student and before I went to university in meeting many leading Christian preachers and thinkers. Martin Lloyd-Jones was an example, who was the first chairman of the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, for whom I work. And having conversations with him about the early part of the 1900s, when the last major revival broke out in Wales, was significant. Wales has sometimes been called the land of revivals. I think there were 5 major revivals between the mid-1700s and the early 1900s. And that shaped the life of the church enormously. I've written about this in one of my books because there was a downside to it. What it highlighted was the power of the gospel to transform lives. But revival isn't a panacea for all the problems in the life of the church. And there was, one of the weaknesses was an overemphasis perhaps on what we call pietism. One of the hallmarks of pietism is a deep devotion to the person of Jesus. But the second dimension should be then the recognition of the lordship of Christ over every sphere of life. I think that was there with the early pietist leaders in Wales and in Germany, where Roland comes from. But I think later pietistic leaders, while retaining that focus on a personal devotion to Christ, maybe their efforts to apply the lordship of Christ to every sphere of life were somewhat weaker. And that was one of the features of the last great revival in Wales in the early 1900s. It led to a strong devotion to the person of Christ, but sometimes in the life of the church led the church to retreat from engagement in society. And it wasn't very robust theologically either. So when liberal views of the Christian faith and the Bible came into the life of the church, there wasn't enough resilience amongst the leaders to publicly rebut or stand against some of those liberal interpretations. So that left us in the 1900s with a legacy of a church that had experienced revival in spiritual life, but wasn't sufficiently robust to take on the intellectual challenges that secularism brought, and led to a church which was inward looking and not able to engage with the world in the way, to the extent that we should.
And it seems that there is a very clear link here your role, your context, Roland, the pietistic context of Germany, which has been so formative for the whole of Northern Europe. Could you reflect on that?
Yes, I think that, and just as Lindsay said, in Germany, we can see two types of pietism, what we call the old pietism and the new pietism, which means the time of the 1700s and early 1800s, which would be the time of the, probably in America, the Great Awakening, or the second, is it this third or first Great Awakening? Anyway, we had something here, and that was engaging, it seems, the world more than the next wave, which came around the turn of the century, and that left us weak and vulnerable against liberal theology on one hand, but also against ideological, political ideology, like Hitler. So there were pietist leaders who said, well, Hitler at least brings law and order, and he prevents communism, so maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we have some evangelistic chances in the midst of all of that. We don't like everything he does, but of course, so in the early times of, there was, as you said, Lindsay, there was maybe not too much or enough emphasis on the lordship of Christ. And if I can just say, as we were thinking about this meeting today, something came to my mind like an image, which is like there's like barriers to understanding the past. And for me as a German, often the past is sort of everything that happened during Nazi times, and then that's what people learn in church. They learn in school, so we wouldn't repeat it, which is a good thing. But it's sort of like, it's like a cement, a layer that doesn't allow us to penetrate a lot deeper. But there's so much history before that, also in Germany and also in all of Europe. So, and then sometimes for us as Protestants, the Reformation, of course, is a very good thing. And Lindsay is speaking about that very much. But still, it's like a layer. And then we don't really look beyond, deeper into the well of history. We don't look into what did God do in the Middle Ages. For us, the Middle Ages is, just a few words and maybe burning of witches or this or that, or crusade, and we don't even understand that is not the whole truth, and maybe it's only a very small part of the truth, because there were great moves of God there at that time. So we need to break through those barriers to really dig deep into history, and then to see what were the riches of what God did in earlier times, where we can draw lessons, and we can maybe even draw the life from those earlier moves of God.
Thanks a lot for highlighting that picture. I think it's an important, a powerful image there, Roland. And we need to go beyond the blockage, beyond that which hinders our view. So you mentioned the Middle Ages, Roland, and if we look back towards the Middle Ages, it seems like it's both an area where there were times of not having a clear view of the gospel. At the same time, there is a rich cultural and spiritual heritage. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, of course, the church in the West suffered greatly by a decision of the Roman central authority that only the Latin Vulgate Bible would be allowed. And then as, for example, the Italian language, which comes out of Latin, or French, which originates in Latin, or Spanish or Portuguese, developed further and further in their vernaculars, but they were not written. People heard the Bible in church read in Latin, but they wouldn't really understand that. So there was a gap. And then that is even more true for those languages that are not directly descendants of Latin, like the Germanic languages, German, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, English, or those that came from a Slavic background. So there was like a funnel. There was like a very minimal channel for biblical truth to reach the people. It was always through the priest. So that, I think, caused a lot of the things that were not so good. At the same time, there were movements of renewal, and some of the monastic movements, like the Cistercians and others, they were really movements of evangelism. Men, young men, of course, it was tied to monasticism, where we can say, is that really so necessary and so biblical? You can find some grounding for that, to be celibate for the kingdom of God, but maybe not as a whole system. But anyway, many of those people who then went beyond their limits, they went into the German forest, they went into uncharted territory. They did so because of a love for Christ and for the people that they wanted to preach to. So that's one of the movements which still kept in the church, but the others are like the movement we have around Petrus Valdez in southern France and northern Italy, the Vaudois, as they say in French, the Waldensians, who translated the Bible into at least parts of the New Testament into the local language, or Wycliffe and the Lollards, as they were called mockingly in England. But there's also in Holland, there was the Brethren of Common Life, Thomas à Kempis. So sometimes I think if we dig a little bit deeper, we can find also those streams of renewal in the Middle Ages. And still the culture as a whole was at least God-fearing. And I mean, they built the cathedrals for the glory of God, of course, also for the glory of the king or that certain city that built it. But there was always this thought of, we do this also for the glory of God. So maybe the Middle Ages wasn't quite as dark as we see it. But of course, biblical knowledge and therefore biblical ethics were limited due to this language problem, which I spoke about.
And when you talk about language problems, Roland, you also talk as a linguist here. And just to get everyone on board on that. And I was just thinking also about the cultural heritage, to reflect further what you shared. You mentioned, Lindsay, about the Oxford, that you went to the Oxford University, of course, with strong Christian cultural roots. And we could think about hospitals, hospices, and the growth of a wide social engagement, community engagement. At the same time, of course, there was a certain breakthrough in terms of rediscovering of the gospel in the Reformation. We'll come back to that in a minute. But before that, if we fast forward or fast rewind, Lindsay, historically here, and go back to the early church, which Roland touched on in the first evening, and you will also touch briefly on in your presentation on the final morning. But briefly, what do you think was the heart of the growth of the gospel and of the church during that seminal period?
Well, I think Roland has highlighted this beautifully in his presentation on the first evening. So I hope that the people listening in to this talk actually are able to go back to and listen to that. But he quoted, as I did, one of the great German theologians, Adolf Harnack, who, when asked, how do you account for the growth of the church from the time of the end of the New Testament until Constantine in the early 300s? That's a period of 270 years. And he said very simply, the early church grew because they outlived and they out-argued the pagans. So I think there are those two dimensions. There are other factors which contributed to the growth of the early church. But I think it's salutary for us today to understand that there were very few church buildings. In fact, I was in Philippi last week, and the guide taking us around, I asked her, was there any evidence of any church buildings before Constantine? And she said, well, first buildings really only came about in this area after the Edict of Milan, 313. Before then, when you talk of churches, it was people meeting in homes. So they established attractive, living Christian communities based in people's homes. And you can see evidence of that in the Acts of the Apostles when it talks about the church meeting in the home of Phoebe or Justice, Justin, and so on, Peter. So I think there were two factors then that contributed to the growth of the church from there. First was the attractiveness of the Christian community, which was highlighted especially in times of pandemic, which is interesting for our own generation. And in his brilliant book, The Rise of Christianity, Rodney Stark, an American sociologist, argues that there wasn't sharp growth in the church for 300 years like that from the end of the AD 30s, but it was staccato growth. There were periods of persecution, but there were two periods of acute and sharp growth, and they were around 150 AD and 250 to 265 AD, which approximate almost exactly with the arrival of great pandemics in Europe. One of them, as I mentioned, lasting for 15 years. We're not sure exactly what the pandemics were. Some historians think one of them was the first impact of measles. But particularly in the second pandemic, around about 250 to 265, historians argue that as much as a third to a quarter to a third of populations in cities in the Roman Empire, particularly in the Mediterranean area, died as a result of this pandemic, much more severe than our own. And as a result, in the midst of all of that, there wasn't an obvious cure. Many believers in the churches that were developing started to reach out to the sick and the suffering. And a lot of elders actually and deacons went into streets to rescue these people, care for them, and a lot of leaders died. And we have early testimonies of bishops' letters being read out in churches, indicating the loss of leaders. But as a consequence, a lot of people were attracted to the Christian church because really they outlived the pagans. I think on the first evening, Roland touched on the Emperor Julian, one of the Roman emperors, who was a pagan, saying that if we don't follow the example of the Christians, that they will take over the hearts and minds of the people in the Roman Empire because they're outliving us. The other dimension, the other contribution, I think, was that God raised up a number of very gifted, they weren't just preachers, but we might call them apologists or defenders of the faith. And they actually took on alternative pagan worldviews at their strong points and demonstrated the superiority of the biblical worldview. People like Tertullian, Irenaeus. There were other great figures in North Africa like Athanasius in Egypt and Augustine in, I think, present-day Tunisia or Algeria. And they demonstrated also the intellectual superiority of the Christian worldview. They won the argument in public, if you like. And I think, therefore, as we look back to the early church, in addition to the various things that Roland beautifully touched on, I think those two factors are salutary for us, for our generation, i.e., we need to build attractive alternative communities in a world where people are looking at and are hungry for community and are feeling a sense of loneliness, particularly in the midst of the pandemic. And also, we need to engage much more in publicly defending and articulating Christian truth and the Christian worldview in the public sphere, in the universities, television, radio, newspapers, more than we have. Unfortunately, in the last 150 years, we tended to retreat from that public sphere. That was a bad mistake. If we really believe the gospel is true and is defensible, we need to engage publicly with alternative worldviews, showing what the gospel has to offer. I think those two key elements were there in the early church in the first 300 years, and I'm sure Roland has others that he could comment on.
So the outliving and the out-arguing are at the heart of things here. Roland, would you like to add anything on this?
Yes. We're speaking about Europe, and that's why we're concentrating on the Roman Empire, the Mediterranean, we're concentrating on the time till Constantine, but there's also a history that is not so much known to us, which is the spread of the gospel into the East. And I just want to mention that, just so that people who want to research into that, beyond the borders of the Roman Empire in what is nowadays Iraq, Iran, even Pakistan, even India, even Afghanistan, even Arabia, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, those areas, they were also touched by the gospel, and as were Egypt was in the Roman Empire, but Nubia, North Africa, Ethiopia. And we know in due time, in the 700s and 800s, what we call the Nestorians, but that is sort of like a bad name. We can call them the Christians of the East, the Syriac Christians of the East. They reached even the imperial court of China with the gospel message. Now, all of this we don't really know about because we're so Eurocentric. And so the Bible was translated in the West into Latin from Greek. The New Testament having been written in Greek, and of course the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, was also a major book for the church. Those two books together in Greek were then translated into Latin in the West, but also into Syriac in the East. And the Syriac language served as the medium of communication even down to India. So that what we see in the West, which we know a bit more about, or much more about, was mirrored by a somewhat hidden history east of the Roman Empire. And that's something I think further generations need to look into, which also helps us to understand that Christianity is not a Western religion, has never been. It reached Africa before it reached Germany. The Nubians were converted before the English, and so forth. I mean, there's Ethiopia had a church long before your country, Sweden or Norway, Lars. So there's this history that we need to learn also. But this out-arguing, which I agree very much with, which I actually learned from Lindsay, and I used in the first night, is of course based on the Bible. And that's why Bible translation was so important. And the eastern part of the church was more open to Bible translation. That's why we have a Coptic version in different Coptic dialects. So we have a Bohairic, which is the northern, a Fayumic, which is the western. We have a Saitic and one or two more Coptic versions of the Bible. We have an Armenian early Bible. We have a Gothic Bibles. The Goths were related to the Swedes and to the Germans, but they lived around the Black Sea. So they had a Bible. We have the Georgian Bible. We have Armenian Bible, as I said, Syriac Bible, a very early competitor, almost at the same time like the old Latin version, so 2nd century. So that was much more in focus. And you can only argue the truth of the scripture if you have the scripture accessible in a language that people can read.
It's wonderful to get a broader perspective here, Roland. Thank you for bringing in the wider, the global context, which for all three of us are so important. If we then, I mean, we could obviously spend, for each era, we could spend the whole time, but we need to cover, I think, the overview here. And so I think we should move to the Reformation time. And of course, for us as evangelicals, that has a very special significance for us. And if I may, let me just highlight the book Into All the World by Lindsay, which you wrote, I think, published last year, and about the missionary vision of Luther and Calvin, focusing on maybe a somewhat neglected or forgotten dimension of the Reformation. So how did you end up writing this book, Lindsay?
Well, there were two reasons behind writing it. The first is, of course, it was the 500th anniversary of the birth of the Reformation in 2017. That's when Luther pinned his thesis to the church door in Wittenberg. It was also just a couple of years later the 500th anniversary of a few years earlier Calvin's birth, and so I was asked to give some presentations on Calvin's legacy in one conference, and then on Luther's legacy in another. And as I was researching recent commentators, I realized that most evangelicals have tended to focus, understandably, primarily on their legacy in terms of recovering the essence of the Christian gospel, revolving around key Christian truths like justification by grace through faith, priesthood of all believers, and the trustworthiness of Scripture. Insteadly, on the issue of justification by grace through faith, the great Welsh preacher Lloyd Jones said that was rediscovered in virtually every revival. And he argued it was as Luther said, it was the article of a standing or a falling church. So it's understandable that historians have tended to focus on the doctrinal rediscoveries. As Roland says, there were people who remained faithful to some of these teachings in previous generations through the Middle Ages, but it came to full fruition, if you like, under Luther's teaching and that of his successors. But what frustrated me is that many historians have argued almost exclusively on the doctrinal issues, whereas I felt that there were two other areas that both Luther and Calvin contributed, which had lessons for us that we should rejoice in, but also which had implications for us in the 21st century. And they were their attempts, I'm not sure if it was deliberate at first, but because they believed in the application of biblical truth to every sphere of life, it really led to the reforming of European culture. The modern age, and so much which is good in the modern age, like scientific discovery, the spread of education, religious toleration, even liberal democracy, and so much else, had its roots in both Luther and Calvin's teaching. One of the weaknesses of contemporary evangelicals in the West is that we tend to focus only on a few issues which we argue define us as evangelicals, things like our attitudes to abortion or capital punishment and so on. That's quite different from Luther and Calvin, who sought to apply the scriptures to every sphere of life, including the visual arts, science, university education, and so on. Luther was instrumental in the formation of many universities all across the Germanic-speaking peoples. And by the time he died, young women were being as well educated as young boys, which really came from some of Luther's teaching. It's quite striking to see how many he persuaded princes start lots of universities as a result of his ministry. The other element, I think, which has been largely neglected even by many evangelical historians, is the missionary vision of Calvin particularly, but also Luther's influence beyond the German-speaking peoples. And I think the last 30 years has seen the growth of a number of evangelical historians, both in Asia, Europe, Africa, and North America, who have begun to see, as they've reread the commentaries by these folks, especially Calvin, their passionate missionary vision. Of course, by and large, Europe was their world. The rest of the world was opening up with the voyages of discovery. But for them, reaching Europe was, in a way, like obeying the Great Commission to take the gospel into all the world. It was more strongly there in Calvin's theology, I think. Some people have argued that Luther was a nationalist. I don't know how accurate that is. But the thing that you learn from Luther is you can't keep truth to one people. And what is striking in the research I did was how many people studied under him in Wittenberg in Germany, and they went on to become the first bishops of the newly formed Lutheran Church in the Nordic countries where you come from, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. And what stunned me was that, I hope you don't mind me just expounding this a little bit. As Roland mentioned, his family came from Eastern Germany. In 1985, I visited the DDR, as it was called, East Germany, with a Norwegian friend, Anfinn Skårheim. It was the 500th anniversary of Luther's birth. And we went to the church where he penned the theses in Wittenberg. And I think the communist government had supported the request of the Lutheran World Federation to put some stained glass windows in the church in Wittenberg of 12 reformers who were influenced by Luther and to a lesser extent Calvin in taking the gospel around Europe. And these 12 stained glass windows were of people from Hungary, in Scandinavia, Denmark and Sweden, even Italy, Gaspard de Coligny in France, and various others. Now, I'd studied European history in Oxford. I only knew 6 of the 12 figures. And to me, that highlighted that I'd not been well taught about the impact of Luther and Calvin's theology or missiology, which led to people taking these truths to other parts of Europe. And of course, the Anglican Church in Britain was really substantially based on Lutheran doctrine, which had a huge impact on the UK and subsequently amongst the settlers in North America. So I could see that if you just take Luther, for example, that was very significant. In Calvin, the historian in Cambridge, Geoffrey Elton, said that many people in the 1550s went because they were persecuted to Geneva when Calvin was there. And in that period, 1553 to 60, there were huge numbers of people who imbibed his teaching. And then as the diaspora took this gospel message all across Europe, and it's been well traced as a consequence. That in itself has lessons for us about harnessing the capacity of the so-called diaspora, or believers migrating to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, one of the big issues of our day. Calvin sent out many missionaries from Geneva, particularly in the 1550s. And by the time he died in the 1560s, the understanding is that there were 2 million evangelical Protestant Christians in France out of a population of 20 million. So it was a phenomenal impact. And it only stopped because of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when many were killed, and because there was a poor transition from Calvin to the next generation of leaders, which also has lessons for us today, but I won't go into that. So the 2 things I felt were being missed out, which contributed to writing the book, were that I felt that in addition to rediscovering the essence of the gospel, they contributed to the reforming of European culture. And it was a re-energized or renewed vision for mission and evangelism. That was comprehensive, and I'm not sure I see it in any other period of history so deeply impacting cultures and for so long, because modern Europe has been shaped by Judeo-Christian framework and the teachings that came out of the Reformation, and it lasted for hundreds of years into the 20th and early 21st century in the face of growing secularism. It lasted because you had Reformation and sporadic revivals subsequently, which refreshed or re-emphasized these truths. I think I should stop there.
Well, this is very rich. Roland, you need to comment on this before we move towards an end here.
Yes, number one is I don't have your book yet, Lindsay, so I'm looking forward to finding it somewhere and maybe translating it into German. It's very important, as you say, to learn that. Can I just say, was Luther a nationalist? I think he was a champion of the German language, but in that he, I think, did have a pan-European view,
Yeah.
because number one, at that time, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation encompassed a great part of other nations, Bohemia, which is the Czech Republic nowadays, and northern Italy, and so forth. And even the emperor was Charles V. At his time was at the same time king of Spain. So I think people had much more of a pan-European view at that time, especially the leaders, and they had a common language, which was Latin. Nationalism, as we know it, I think has two sides. It has a good side, and that was furthered, I think, by the Reformation with the different Bible translations. Tyndale was certainly influenced by Luther. There's some possibility that he even spent a short time in Wittenberg with Luther. We don't exactly know that, but there's indications for that. Then there's, as you said, there's Hungarian Bible, there's Slovenian Bible, which was brought the Reformation and also formed the modern day Slovenian language. And there's even a little coin for Tribor, what is his name, Primož Trubar or something like that. Yeah, and so forth. So there's a lot of that. And nationalism then in the 19th century became very much linked with nation states and powers, and European powers fighting against each other and trying to outdo and be the bigger, and that's what basically led us into the catastrophe of the First World War and then the Second World War subsequently. But I think the good side of nationalism was to strengthen the identity of ethnic groups. The bad side is that then this attempt of domination, one group dominating the other group. But Luther himself, yes, he was a champion of the German language, but I think he championed, as was said by Lindsay beautifully, championed also the spread of the gospel in local languages into other countries. And there was no desire to dominate them, but just to see the gospel grow all over Europe.
Yeah, I think you could legitimately say Luther loved the German language and the German people. He loved the gospel even more. And that was the driving force in his life. And you mentioned Primož Trubar there, who's called the father of the Slovenian peoples. But you know what many historians call him is the little Luther, because he picked up on Lutheran teachings, and he proclaimed that message in what is present-day Slovenia, southern Germany, Austria, and so on. There were many others like this, including some of those bishops I mentioned in the Nordic or Scandinavian countries, and the Anglicans in Britain, who were really deeply shaped by Luther, to an extent that both the gospel advanced in Europe and also the European nations and cultures were deeply enriched by these two giants that God raised up in the 15 and 1600s, Luther and Calvin.
Yes, in terms of Scandinavia, we could have mentioned the brothers Petri, Olaus and Laurentius Petri, for example, in Sweden. But it's not time for that, I'm afraid. And what we did, what we will remember, Lindsay and I, is watching Roland playing, acting Martin Luther in Wittenberg. That's an unforgettable experience, Roland. So our viewers and listeners here will not, many of them will not have had that privilege. But it's showing the richness of the story, of the history, and of his biography, and rediscovering of the gospel, the rekindling of the missionary vision, and the renewing and the reformation of the culture, as well, as you pointed out, Lindsay. So I think we have touched on so many things, and I think that was also the point, to open up these rich areas. And I think we would agree, all three of us, that we don't want to idealize any past eras, not even the Reformation, which also had its blind spots, and we don't have time to go into that. But I think it's important to acknowledge that. And so, but we are, at the same time, we want to learn from the past. And when we shared our thoughts on beforehand, we mentioned Kenneth Scott Latourette, who has written a very important, I think, 6-volume history of the church, and focusing what he calls 6 weapons of the Christian: evangelism, prayer, argument, lifestyle, action, and suffering. That's a very rich list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a very decisive list in terms of, we could have, one can explore the whole of history from each of those 6 perspectives and see how God has raised up individuals, raised up communities, which we have touched on here, raised up movements, revivals, reformations. And it's of course our prayer that today God will raise up and renew through the combination of the public proclamation, the public defense, and the integral life of the witnesses. We just would like to end there, but maybe a few words from each one of you. Is there one thing you would like to highlight just in a few sentences? Roland first.
We can trust that God was at work in all periods of history, and it is our calling, our obligation, our passion, our joy to discover where God is at work. And if there's one lesson we can learn, is that God is always a God of new starts. So even those areas of Europe or the world where the gospel is weak at the moment, we can just pray, and we can also expect that God will do something new. And that's what we should work for and pray for and trust for.
Thank you for that, Roland. And Lindsay, finally, briefly.
Well, I think what Roland said is wonderful. I don't think I can improve on that, except to say that in both those major periods we looked at, the early church, post-New Testament, and the Reformation, I think you see these 2 common factors. That is, Christians who lived distinctive and godly lives and formed attractive communities, of which John Stott said the calling to the church is to remain morally distinct but not socially segregated. And we often confuse the two. That the godly living, the distinctive communities engaged in the culture, rubbing shoulders with people as Jesus did. And secondly, the vigorous and passionate, convicting public communication of the gospel was a hallmark of the early church fathers and the reformers. And I think to see a transformation in the European context, we need to focus on many things, but especially those 2, because they seem to be common factors in the growth and the expansion of God's church. The articulate public proclamation of the gospel and its defense, and attractive communities of God's people who engage in a transformative way in the culture in which God has placed them. And I think we should pray that God helps our generation to apply those 2 lessons from the early church and the Reformation era.
Thanks a lot, both of you, for this rich conversation where we have touched on so many important things. And there will be a few minutes left when this will be broadcast during the gathering. So there will be some opportunities of engaging afterwards. But thank you very much, and every blessing for your ministries in exactly the areas that you highlighted there, Lindsay. Thanks also, Roland.
Thanks, Lars. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you both.